Okay, for this video, what I'm going to do is just walk you through the planning process that I use. Now, I am teaching completely outside, so all I'm considering is how the outdoors is actually inspiring me to cover the content and the skills I've got in mind that I want my learners to actually achieve through this topic. So the topic I'm going to be focusing on is looking at my space or my place. So I'm just going to go through how I would undertake that planning process. And I do that by coming out in the environment and actually looking for inspiration here. Now, when you're starting a topic, of course, you need your learners to input on that. So taking them out, the first thing I'm thinking is to get them to be inspired by this space as well. So I'd go for an explorative walk and just observe how they interact with that space. Ask them some key questions, but get them to start thinking about this space as a place for learning. So we'd just take a walk around the locations and I'd be prompting a few questions, but also observing how they're interacting with the space and thinking about what questions might be coming up. Once I've got their input, then I'm going to think about where I'm going to get my inspiration from. And previous to taking them out, I'm going to go on my own inspirational walk and I'm going to see what captivates me and what provides me with some inspiration for coming up with ways to teach certain content and certain skills. And that's what I'm going to take you on today. I'm going to take you for my planning walk that I will be undertaking. Now, the first idea I have when I identified looking around this space is to think how this space actually makes them feel. So linking this into the health and wellbeing AOLE, they could look at surveying which part of the school grounds they like and which bits they don't like. And then from that data, we could create some bar graphs or some pictograms, and we could use emojis as well. We could look at turning this into a better way of presenting data by looking at the problems with the bar graphs and using this categorical data, and use this to move on to the use of maps to represent data. Then we could map the emotions using emojis at different locations. So we could drill down into the reasons why different areas create different emotions, and now how these emotions differ from others in their class. And they could follow this up in class, produce a mental map of perception. So if we color-coded a map of moods using a color scheme that they derive for each emotion, then this could feed into creating a piece of artwork depicting the perception of the space in an abstract piece of art. Next, they could start to build their own map out of natural materials that they'll find outside. So they create a representation of the school grounds using those natural materials. They can then transfer that onto a piece of paper, so they've got a visual representation of it, and use it to try and get partners to find locations in the school grounds. Based on that map that they've created, they can think about how accurate it is, and is there any way we can make it more accurate? And think about OS maps, maybe doing a comparison between the two and see what's different between them. So thinking about representation of landforms, have they thought about how they're going to put in things like hills, but also a key. So they've probably got a key if they've done it on the piece of paper. So what have they used for those items? And does it end up getting too busy when they're trying to draw complete perfect versions? Once they've worked out what are the problems with their map and how they can try and improve it, we're talking about accuracy now. So what's the main reason we have maps and why do we have maps? Looking at direction, position, and also distance. So then we start talking about scaling and accuracy in terms of, is that map actually to scale? And how do we make our map correct? We can then start to go inside and use a base map used from Google Earth just to get that proper scale map and draw in that base map, and then come outside with that base map and put in those landscape features that aren't possible to see on Google Earth or that are new to your area, and then drawing that on top of your map. And then you create a much more accurate to scale map, which again you can repeat in that activity to try and find those locations to make sure it's much more accurate than your previous map. You can then teach about scale if we haven't done that, or revisit scale. And a brilliant way of doing that is you looking at Google Earth and just zooming out and then working out how we can work out the scale of our maps. Once you've got that scaled base map, you can then create the scale of your map or calculate it. by looking at some things. So you can either provide some scaffold for this or some differentiation. So for example, if you had a Google image of your school grounds that had a scale of 100 times what's on the ground, then that'd be quite easy to calculate. You could also scaffold learners by giving them some prompts such as, what is the size of the yard on the map? What is the size of the yard in real life? And then offer some obvious features such as the size of the field. So once they've got a scale, they can draw a scale line underneath the drawing. They can also write a ratio. That can then be evaluated or assessed by using that to create a treasure hunt, treasure trail for their partner. So they use that map to locate specific places where they've hidden something. Their partner then follows it. You can use directional language so they can follow instructions. They can look at direction in terms of north, south, east, west, or it can be directions turning left, 90 degrees turn to the right, clockwise, anti-clockwise turning. All that directional language you can bring in there. You can also lay some lines, some grid lines onto your map and start bringing in some coordinates or some grid referencing as well. Also then you can start doing another treasure hunt, finding locations of places using your grid references or your coordinates. So building up those mapping skills, but also you're building up a resource that you can then use again, or you can use it for another year group. Once the maps are perfect, we can use them to teach or revisit area, perimeter and shape. So on the map, they measure some areas and perimeters and identify some shapes, and then they check the answers by measuring it outside. Then reverse it, measure outside the area and perimeter of the yard and check against the map. Starting to go a bit further afield than the school grounds, we could come to this spot and start to look at perspective. What is the furthest thing you can see? Estimate the distance to that location. How can we check? So you could give out OS maps of the area, measuring the distance. We could also look at landscape drawing, looking at land use site types such as rural or urban land use, obviously depending on your area. And then we could look at some examples of landscape artists such as Kevin Williams and looking at some of the colours that he used. And he's been told that he overuses the colour black. So we could think about the colours that you can use in the landscape pictures of him, but also compare it to maybe some of the colours we used in our mood mapping and deciding what black represents. So we're coming back to that health and well-being and emotional connection with that sense of place as well. We can also look at other landscape artists such as Gwilym Pritchard landscape drawing pictures, or we could look at Peter Prendergast, which does cubic style, and Cedric Lockwood Morris, who actually lived locally here in Sketty, and he focused on the detail of the plants and the flowers. The students could then create their own landscape portrait of this environment. So they can use within one of the artist's style or create their own style. This view is also really useful to think about changes to this space over time. Creating the atmosphere by getting students to sit here maybe and reading accounts of the school grounds being used by American soldiers in the war to billet them, and also accounts of children being evacuated to Gower. So if you read with the learners looking out at this view and point out the locations where the tents were and the road that the children coming from London would have been evacuated down, really will bring it to life. We can then inside get the children to write a letter to an evacuee telling them all about Gower and why it's a great place to come and live. We could create a model of the space in the past along with our little bell tents here. And this could be a large-scale challenge, so it could be an independent challenge or working in groups. So they're researching old photos, looking at old maps and culminating in a presentation of what it's like in that time. So talking to the class and maybe taking them for a walk around the school grounds and pointing out where certain things would have been. And really try and use descriptive language to evoke the feeling of the time. What was it like with these American airmen living on this site here? If you've got trees that have been chopped down and you know when they were chopped down, it's great to use this as the going back in time tool. So if you know that this growth line here was 2021, then you can go back in time and find out what the school was like or your grounds were like when this tree was a sapling in this year here. So this is a great resource if you've got a stump that you know when it was actually chopped down, and trying to write a narrative of what it was like to be this tree and go through its whole life and how the landscape around it changed while it was growing up. Back in time further, we can explain the landforms we've got. So why is this hill in the background? Kevin Bryn here. What rock type does it have? Doing a hunt around the school grounds to see if we can find any of the underlying rocks. Then when we do find what's underneath our feet, we could then sort it, categorize it, name it, draw the different rock types, and then that will leave us really nicely into a field trip up onto Kevin Bryn to see the landscape from close up. So again, we could walk from school or we could get a bus, but we can use that journey to revisit and assess our map use, following the map and estimating difference. Once we're on the hill, we can look at contour lines and playing games like Eagle Eye to see how the difference in contours makes it difficult to be seen from the highest point. We could go on a rock hunt, so we'll look in detail at the different rocks, visit King Arthur's Stone and hear about the legends of the stone, looking at the rock type and the geology maps to determine where the rocks from King Arthur's Stone came from. Sketch the rock, do some rubbings to see the difference between the textures, looking at shadow and how you can use that to create 3D images. Then we can collect rock samples out on the field and bring them back to school, undertaking a science investigation into the hardness of the different rock types. So we could quartz and calcite by rubbing them with different materials. Then we can relate to the landforms we see and try and work out why these landforms are like this. And they can make their own conglomerate using mud and pebbles, and there's lots of practical things they can do with fossils and other stones as well. When we come back to school, we can then also look for any rocks. There's one over there. There we go, I can see one there. So we can see any rocks that might have been from the same place as King Arthur's Stone. How did they get here? Think about the journey of the rock, and that could be some creative writing, the story of the rocks in our school grounds. How did they get here? Were they brought by man? Have they been here for hundreds of years? Were they brought here on top of wooden rollers like they did in the Egyptian times? Or have they been brought here as erratics from glaciation? So again, it's just an imaginative activity to do using the landscape around you as a prompt. The outdoor space, of course, goes beyond your school grounds, so consider going for a local village walk. So again, you can see what questions arise as you walk around your local village or to your local area. See what prompts you can use. Think about what's happened in the past in those locations. Find clues in the names of the houses. For old industries or residents, look at what jobs there are today or the jobs there were in the past. Visit your post office or talk to the postmistress. You can do graphs of the building's use and the open space. You can look at local services and interesting buildings, see how they've changed over time. Look at old maps to see how the area's changed. Visit the graveyards to see names from local area. Is there any local names that are still in your class? You can do the maths of the average age of death in the past, or you can undertake an air pollution study by looking at the lichen on the gravestones and compare those to ones you found in your school grounds. Back in school, you could do a recount of the day, looking at the descriptive language and also the directions and how things have changed. You can put sketches together, you could put those photos together and start to do some animation. So to bring it all together in one big celebration, you could do a big scaled model of this place to provide that sense of space. You could do about the landforms, you could create them, you could also do the houses or the facilities, you could even do a cut through to show the geology underneath, and all that information that they've gathered either over time or at this moment in time brings it all together in this fantastic 3D model that you can then share with other people to show all that stuff that they've discovered in this one model. We could also get some other perspectives of that sense of space, get some local people to come in and to present to the children. So this is just me brainstorming as I've been walking around this school grounds. There's a load more we could go into. Obviously, there's some really obvious topics that make you really easy to plan outdoors if you're doing habitats, for example. But don't just be restricted to the obvious things. I could still go around this grounds and plan some activities for looking at something which is really not relevant to the outdoors as well at all. So we could be looking at Egyptians. Again, think about those stones that we had. How do we move those stones? Using the slope of the landscape to move materials up and down, imagining that it's a pyramid that we're making. So hopefully this is a very different way of planning, but this might give you some ideas of how to get some inspiration from your school grounds to do some outdoor learning and putting it into your planning.